Okay, you've passed the halfway point. This is week 3 out of 4. And this week we're doing nonfiction. Uh, Nonfiction is my hidden gem. I think not a lot of 2110 teachers teach nonfiction. Um, I read a lot of nonfiction. I'm always reading something. Nonfiction has sort of exploded or reemerged with the internet. We've also had a lot of people writing memoirs in the past, couple years. A lot of famous people writing memoirs, but also not so famous people. Um, and I just really like learning things and hearing other people's opinions and thoughts about everything. So I read a lot of nonfiction about all sorts of stuff. I read a lot of science stuff. I like to know what scientists are doing. I like to read about history. I just read um, a book about the history of the term white trash, and it was really fascinating. Um, but I've also read history books about like spies and things like that. Um, but this week, nonfiction about movies and television. And some of the people you might know by name and some you might not. So I'll give you a little bit of background about each piece as usual. Um, Flick Chicks by Mindy Kaling is one of my favorite nonfiction pieces, and it's one of my favorite things to teach when I teach this class face-to-face and we talk about Flick Chicks. I ask students to think about movies that connect to or that represent the different types of female characters that she's talking about, because everyone can name at least 2 movies that feature the klutz, or the woman who's old enough to be the mom of the male romantic interest. She's so funny. I think Mindy Kaling's hilarious, but she's also right. And that's, everybody comes in the day after they've read this and they're like, oh my God, she's so right. Everything she said is true. What is wrong with the world? So Mindy Kaling is writing from her own experience as a comedian, as an actress, and as a writer. She was on The Office and The Mindy Project, so you might recognize her if you kind of Google her and actually see what she looks like. So she's a comedian, she's using humor in the writing, but also making a serious point. So the discussion board question for this week is simply asking you, if she's making a serious point, if she really cares about, the lack of serious roles for women, or, kind of not cliche, not stereotype roles, why is she using humor to make her point? It shouldn't be a difficult question to answer once you've read the article. So enjoy that. How I Look at Movies by Philip Lopate is not funny. And in fact, it might be frustrating. Philip Lopate is a film critic. That is his job. That's what he gets paid to do. He gets paid to watch movies and write about them and tell people what he thinks about them. And he's been doing it for a long time. He comes from a more sort of scholarly perspective, and not from a pop culture perspective like Mindy Kaling does. So his attitude, his voice is different. And that's what the question in the discussion board is about. What do you think about Philip Lopate? So if you want to connect this essay, How I Look at Movies, back to things you learned in 1020 or 1010, in your composition classes, there are definitely questions you can ask about ethos, logos, and pathos in Lopate's essay. How is he drawing on pathos? What is the role of ethos? His sort of presence as an authority on film. He's It's an interesting piece. I don't expect you to know all of the types of movies that he's talking about, but like I've said before, we have the internet now. We have Google. You can look it up. So when he mentions a filmmaker's name, you can go to YouTube and look at a clip or a trailer and find out, okay, what are these movies that Philip Lopate says that he really likes? He says this person is one of his favorite filmmakers. What does that look like? He says he hated this movie. What does that movie look like? What's that movie about? You can always Google and learn more. And that's something that you couldn't necessarily do in the past. So I encourage you to look up the movies that Lopate is talking about, or the types of movies. Another essay you're reading this week is The Persisting Vision, Reading the Language of Cinema, and this one is by Martin Scorsese, who I hope you know who he is. But I cry a little bit every time I teach this, and students don't know who he is. You may not recognize his name, but he's one of the most famous American film directors. He directed Wolf of Wall Street, he directed Goodfellas, he directed Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, The Departed. He's done a lot of movies, Shutter Island. He's just done a lot with Leonardo DiCaprio recently, to be honest. And I'm got questions about that. If you saw the movie Hugo when you were a kid, he did Hugo. Martin Scorsese started making movies in the 70s. He went to college to study filmmaking. He is obsessed with movies. And The Persisting Vision is about his obsession and how he got into movies as a kid, the role they've played in his life, why he's intrigued in them, and why he thinks they should be preserved, because now he's trying to save the movies. They're not endangered, but he wants to make sure that people in the future can see the movies that he grew up with and that people are making now. So it's a very personal essay, again, a different approach than Kaling or Lopate, and I think you get a good feeling for the type of person Martin Scorsese is through this essay. Next, you have Leaving Reality, and John Jeremiah Sullivan is a journalist by trade, and so he's, again, different from Scorsese and Kaling and Lopate, although maybe more in common with Lopate, because Lopate's a professional critic. Sullivan has worked as a journalist. He's had stuff in newspapers all over. He's had stories in GQ, and that's where this one came from. Leaving Reality was written for GQ. He does a lot of journalism about popular culture, so he has a very different approach and voice than Philip Lopate. He writes about things that he's interested in, things that he's a fan of. He has articles about Axl Rose, about Michael Jackson, about sports and things like that. He has a whole book that he wrote. His father was also a journalist, but his father was a sports journalist. So he wrote about what it was like growing up with his dad, what his relationship with his dad was like, but also about his dad's work as a sports writer, and sort of focuses on horse racing as this sort of connection between them. It's a fun book. I teach it in other classes. But this essay is about the television show The Real World. And The Real World is still on MTV, is still going. If you have never seen The Real World, again, please go to YouTube and look up a minute or two of the show. You don't need really more than a minute or two to get an idea. But The Real World was the first reality TV series of any great length. There were other shows that were sort of documentary, reality type shows that would be like one-off specials following, a day in the life of people. But The Real World started the trend of putting a group of people together in sort of a strange situation and filming them for several months at a time. It started in the early 90s. I think it was 93 was the first season, or 92. And as the opening credits of the show tell you, it's 7 strangers picked to live in a house and find out what it's like when people stop being polite and start getting real. You can imagine how things go from there. Sorry, the camera cut out for a minute. But for the real world, they pick a diverse cast all the time, people from all different walks of life. And it was the first show to really do that. And we wouldn't have things like Survivor or Big Brother or even The Bachelor, The Bachelorette without the real world, because all of these sort of dramas, the sort of challenges, the romances, all of these were part of the real world in the beginning. So it's an important show, and Sullivan is trying to get at what the difference between reality and reality TV is. Reality, real life, reality as we see it on television. And there are some revelations. I know we all know reality TV is fake at this point, but he shows us, just how far they go to fake some things, and it's a little bit shocking. The last thing you're reading this week is E Unibus Colorum, Television and U.S. Fiction by David Foster Wallace, who was a novelist, a journalist, and an essay writer. And this essay, he's really trying to think about how television has affected writers and storytelling in the United States. Wallace was born in 1962, which was around the time when televisions were in almost every home. They had reached kind of saturation in the early 60s. And he's part of the first generation of writers to grow up with television, to have watched TV from their childhood to adulthood. Before that, they didn't. And he says, television is all about stories, whether it's news stories or soap operas or sitcoms or dramas. So if writers used to be influenced by written stories, we're clearly also being influenced by the stories on television now. So what effect have they had? And on the discussion board, I ask you, how does David Foster Wallace feel about television? Did he watch television? What kind of television does he watch? How does he feel about it? Does he like television? Does he hate television? Is he conflicted about it? Eventually it becomes clear, spoiler alert, that he thinks there's a problem with television. So what is the problem, and how does he think we can fix it? What do we need to do to fix television? Because he thinks that television is important for some reasons. But you have to read to find out why. This is a very long and very challenging essay. There will be things you need to look up on Google, on YouTube, and in the dictionary. I've read a lot of things by David Foster Wallace. I've read his fiction, his short stories, his novels, and he has an amazing vocabulary. He uses words that I don't even know what they are. He likes to use words that are from, very specific what's the word I'm trying to think of? He likes to use jargon from other areas of study. He'll use a term from physics when he's talking about literature. So don't be afraid or ashamed to look things up in the dictionary. I have looked up lots of words that he's used. And it's good to add new words to your vocabulary. but don't give up on him, because he can be frustrating at times because he's using all these words. He writes like he's having a conversation with you, so it's not necessarily straight and to the point. And sometimes you're like, just tell me what you're thinking. Tell me what the point is, please. But he is trying to engage the reader in this sort of conversation. So bear with him. I think it's really worth it when you get it to the end. But also remember that he wrote this in 1994, which was a long time ago now. And it's probably before some of you were born. Television was different in 1994. Things have changed. So try and remember what TV was like before reality television. Think about what television was like when you were growing up, what your parents watched, things like that. That's what David Foster Wallace is talking about. All right. As always, if you have questions, let me know. If you're struggling with something, let me know. Otherwise, congratulations on making it halfway through. Next week, you're not reading anything, but you have 2 writing assignments. So I'll be back with another video, and I will see you then. Bye.